Welcome to Mystery Stories, where quiet villages hide restless hearts and polite smiles conceal dangerous intentions. Here, every whisper matters, every pause has meaning, and the smallest detail can change everything. Settle in, breathe deeply, and let the calm voice of the story guide you into a world where truth unfolds gently. Yet nothing is ever quite as safe as it seems. Chapter 1. The gossip began before the envelope was even opened. It traveled ahead of the post, as village gossip always did, slipping through hedges and over teacups, carried in lowered voices and raised eyebrows. Miss Marple heard it first from Mrs. Carter, who leaned a little too far across the garden fence and said, quite casually, that it was very interesting how everyone had been invited to Mr. Alistair Hale's dinner at once, as though he feared someone might be missed. Miss Marple smiled, thanked her for the roses she was trimming, and thought how urgency often disguised itself as hospitality. The invitation itself arrived that afternoon, thick cream paper, the lettering precise and courteous. It said nothing out of the ordinary, only that Mr. Hale hoped Miss Marple would join him for dinner on Thursday, as several friends and neighbors would be present. Yet the tone was oddly careful, each sentence polished as though revised more than once. Miss Marple noticed that at once. People who wrote with such care were often attempting to control something already slipping away. On Thursday evening, the house glowed warmly against the darkening lane, every window lit, the curtains drawn with deliberate neatness. The scent of roasted meat drifted out as Miss Marple approached, mingling pleasantly with wood smoke and damp leaves. It was all very welcoming. Perhaps too welcoming. Houses did not usually try quite so hard. Inside, the hallway hummed with restrained cheer. Coats were taken, compliments exchanged, and polite laughter echoed just a fraction too loudly. Miss Marple noticed how Mrs. Halbrook smoothed her gloves again and again, though they were already perfectly arranged. Mr. Fenwick hovered near the fireplace, holding his glass without drinking from it. Others spoke brightly, yet their eyes moved often, too often, toward the closed door of the study. The dining room was arranged with careful symmetry. The long oak table gleamed, candles already lit, casting soft shadows across polished silver. Miss Marple took her seat midway down the table, well placed to observe, without appearing to do so. It was a position she found useful in all gatherings, allowing conversation to flow around her like water while she quietly noted its currents. As soup was served, conversation turned to safe subjects. Weather, the state of the lane after recent rain, the church roof that still needed repairs. Laughter came easily at first, but Miss Marple noticed how it lagged by a heartbeat, as though everyone waited to hear if it was permitted. Mrs. Halbrook offered compliments freely, too freely, praising the food, the house, the company, her voice a shade brighter than usual. Compliments delivered in that tone were rarely sincere. They were shields. Mr. Fenwick said very little. When addressed directly, he responded politely, briefly, then returned his attention to his plate. Miss Marple observed that he ate almost nothing, though he shifted his knife and fork as though to appear engaged. Silence, she had long ago decided, was often louder than speech. Between courses, a remark drifted down the table, barely a remark at all, offered as an aside. Someone mentioned that old wills were troublesome things, forever needing adjustment as circumstances changed. It was said lightly, followed by a laugh that invited agreement. Several people nodded. One person did not. Miss Marple noticed how Mrs. Hale's fingers tightened briefly around her napkin before she forced them still. Soup gave way to roast, and the air grew heavier with warmth and scent. Voices rose again, though the ease did not return entirely. Miss Marple caught fragments as they floated past her. Questions about travel plans, vague references to business matters, a mention of a cousin who had not been seen for years. Each remark seemed harmless alone. Together they formed a pattern of gentle probing, as though everyone were circling the same unspoken subject, careful not to touch it directly. Halfway through the meal, a curious thing happened. Mr. Hale, who had been attentive and composed, began to glance repeatedly toward the door. When he finally rose, apologizing for leaving early due to fatigue, his words were smooth, but his voice carried a faint strain, like fabric pulled too tight. Miss Marple noticed how quickly his chair was pushed back, how decisively he avoided meeting anyone's eyes. The room reacted at once, though no one acknowledged it openly. There was a collective easing, a soft exhale that passed from one end of the table to the other. Plates were set down more carelessly. Someone laughed with genuine relief. Miss Marple found that detail far more interesting than the host's departure. People did not relax when someone left unless that person had been a source of tension. As dessert was served, conversation became freer, but not lighter. A domestic detail caught Miss Marple's attention then. A serving dish had been replaced. Subtly, almost imperceptibly. The custard offered now was not the one she had seen prepared earlier in the kitchen. When she commented gently on its richness, the maid hesitated before replying, her eyes flicking toward the study door before she smiled, and said it was a last-minute adjustment. Such adjustments, Miss Marple knew, were rarely accidental. Later, coffee was taken in the drawing room. Chairs were drawn closer together, voices lowered. Mrs. Halbrook leaned toward Miss Marple and remarked, with practiced casualness, that it was kind of Mr. Hale to gather everyone while he could. Miss Marple asked what she meant by while he could, and Mrs. Halbrook laughed, saying only that one never knew what changes life might bring. The laugh came too quickly, ending too abruptly. Across the room, Mr. Fenwick finally drank from his glass, then set it aside untouched. Miss Marple observed that he wiped his mouth carefully, as though removing a taste he disliked. When asked if he was enjoying himself, he replied that everything was quite satisfactory, placing a curious emphasis on the last word. As the evening drew to a close, farewells were exchanged with exaggerated warmth. Miss Marple noticed how several guests paused near the front door, as though reluctant to be the first to leave. One woman adjusted her shawl twice. Another returned briefly to the drawing room under the pretense of retrieving gloves she already held. Outside, the night was cool and still. Miss Marple walked home at an unhurried pace, her thoughts moving more quickly than her feet. She considered the invitation's careful wording, the rehearsed compliments, the altered dish, the host's sudden departure. None of it proved anything. Yet together they whispered of something amiss, something pressing hard enough to ripple through an entire evening. By the time she reached her gate, she had decided on one thing with certainty. Whatever had brought those people to the table that night had not been hospitality alone. And Miss Marple, smiling kindly to herself as she turned in, wondered why a simple dinner had left so many hearts racing, and whether the true reason had already slipped quietly into the shadows. Chapter 2. The house woke reluctantly the next morning, as though it would have preferred to remain silent. Miss Marple noticed that detail before she noticed anything else. Houses, like people, carried moods, and the one belonging to Mr. Hale seemed to resist the ordinary rhythms of morning. Curtains were drawn later than usual. The clink of breakfast china came without its customary cheer. Even the birds in the garden sounded oddly restrained, their calls brief and cautious, as if unsure they were welcome. The first remark reached Miss Marple through the most reliable of village channels. The maid's sister, who cleaned at the vicarage, had mentioned, purely in passing, that no breakfast tray had been returned from the upstairs corridor. Miss Marple received this information while being handed her change at the baker's, the words delivered with studied casualness. She thanked the girl warmly, stepped aside, and felt the smallest tightening behind her eyes. Breakfast trays, when untouched, were rarely insignificant. Later that morning, she called at the house under the harmless pretense of returning a borrowed book. The front door was answered more quickly than she expected, then held open a fraction too long. The maid's smile appeared only after she recognized Miss Marple, and even then it did not quite reach her eyes. Inside, the air smelled faintly of polish, and something sharper beneath it. Brandy, Miss Marple thought. though no glass stood nearby. The hallway was tidy to the point of strain, as though every surface had been wiped twice. Tidiness taken to such extremes often followed disorder. Miss Marple commented pleasantly on the fine weather, and asked after Mr. Hale. The reply came after a pause long enough to notice. "He's resting," the maid said, choosing the word carefully. "The doctor called earlier, just to be sure you understand." Miss Marple nodded, murmuring how sensible that was. Doctors were always called to be sure when people were already quite certain something was wrong. As she spoke, she observed the maid's hands. One thumb rubbed repeatedly against the edge of her apron, worrying the fabric into a soft crease. It was not the movement of a girl merely delivering information. It was the movement of someone waiting to be asked the wrong question. Miss Marple did not ask it. Instead, she allowed her gaze to drift, politely unfocused, taking in the small, domestic details that others dismissed. A coat hung over the banister, neatly folded, yet out of place for that hour. A gentleman's coat. Mr. Hale's, most likely. She recalled seeing it the night before. He had been wearing it when he excused himself from dinner. Coats were usually returned to closets after use. Leaving one behind suggested haste, distraction, or interruption. From upstairs came a muted sound. Footsteps, slow and careful. Miss Marple listened without appearing to do so. There was no rhythm to them, no sense of purpose. They stopped. Started again. Someone unsure of where they were going. Before she could comment further, Mrs. Hale appeared at the top of the stairs. Her expression was composed, her posture correct, yet Miss Marple noticed the faint shadow beneath her eyes and the way her hand rested on the banister, as though drawing steadiness from it. She descended slowly, greeting Miss Marple with warmth that arrived a second too late. They spoke of ordinary things, how kind everyone had been to come the night before, how tiring such gatherings could be. Mrs. Hale mentioned that her husband often overdid things when determined to be hospitable. Miss Marple agreed readily, remarking how generosity sometimes exacted a quiet cost. At the mention of breakfast, Mrs. Hale hesitated. Just for a moment. Then she said lightly that Mr. Hale had not felt like eating. Miss Marple observed how her voice softened, almost pleading, as though hoping the explanation would be accepted without question. Miss Marple did accept it. Outwardly. Before leaving, she glanced once more toward the corridor that led to the study. The door was closed. It had not been the night before. She remarked on how sensible it was to keep certain rooms private during illness. Mrs. Hale agreed quickly, too quickly, adding that there was nothing of interest there in any case. Miss Marple smiled. There was always something of interest in rooms people insisted were dull. Outside, she encountered Mr. Fenwick, who stood by the gate as though uncertain whether to approach or retreat. He greeted her politely, then remarked that it had been a most trying night. When Miss Marple asked if he meant the dinner, he corrected himself at once, saying only that he had slept poorly. His eyes flicked toward the house, then away again. "I thought I heard someone moving about very late," he added, as though the thought had escaped him uninvited. "After everyone had gone to bed, I mean." Miss Marple responded mildly that houses often made noises at night. Pipes shifted. Floors settled. Mr. Fenwick nodded, but he did not look reassured. Instead, he mentioned, casually, of course, that the footsteps had sounded deliberate, not wandering, purposeful. He fell silent after that, as though realizing he had already said too much. As Miss Marple walked home, she turned the morning over in her mind. Untouched trays, lingering coats, footsteps without rhythm, the smell of brandy where it did not belong. None of it shouted. It murmured, and murmurs, she had learned, were far more dangerous than cries. That afternoon, another piece slipped quietly into place. Mrs. Carter stopped her by the postbox and said, quite confidentially, that it was odd how the doctor had been sent for before breakfast, not after. Miss Marple expressed polite surprise and remarked how considerate it was to attend to health promptly. Still, Mrs. Carter said, lowering her voice, one wonders what happened during the night to make it so urgent. Miss Marple wondered too. That evening, as dusk settled gently over the village, Miss Marple sat by her window and watched the lights come on one by one. At the Hale house, the study remained dark. The rest of the windows glowed softly, offering the illusion of normality. Illusions, Miss Marple reflected, were very comforting things. Yet as she prepared for bed, one thought refused to settle. Whatever had kept that house awake through the night had not been illness alone. It had been movement, intent, and perhaps a decision made when everyone else believed the evening safely over. And Miss Marple, folding her shawl and turning down the lamp, felt the quiet certainty that the night had not finished speaking, and that when it did, the village would no longer be able to pretend it had heard nothing at all. Chapter 3. The village decided what had happened long before anyone thought to ask. Miss Marple became aware of this shortly after 11 o'clock, when she stepped into Mrs. Linton's sitting room and found the air already thick with conclusions. Teacups were aligned neatly on the tray, the good biscuits set out despite it not being Sunday, and 3 women sat forward in their chairs as though waiting for permission to speak. It was Mrs. Linton who provided it, lowering her voice and saying that it was such a relief Mr. Hale had been seen by the doctor so promptly. Relief, Miss Marple reflected, was rarely discussed so earnestly unless fear had arrived first. She took her cup, thanked her hostess, and listened. That was always the most important part. People revealed far more when they believed they were being helpful rather than questioned. Mrs. Linton spoke of overexertion, of the strain of entertaining so many guests at once. Mrs. Price mentioned, with a delicate cough, that nerves could do dreadful things to a man as he aged. Someone else added that it was fortunate Mrs. Hale had insisted on calling the doctor early, before matters grew worse. Miss Marple noticed how no one mentioned what matters they meant. The talk drifted, as it always did, toward recollection. Someone recalled a raised voice heard weeks earlier during a walk past the Hale garden. Another remembered Mr. Hale appearing distracted at the market, asking twice for the same item. These observations were offered kindly, sympathetically, yet Miss Marple sensed how quickly kindness could sharpen into something else if given time. When she asked, quite mildly, whether anyone had actually seen Mr. Hale that morning, there was a brief pause. Mrs. Linton said no. Of course not. He was resting. Mrs. Price nodded, then added that the curtains upstairs had remained drawn far later than usual. She said it with the tone of someone presenting a harmless detail, yet her eyes were alert, watchful. Miss Marple stirred her tea. Curtains drawn late suggested either illness or secrecy. The village preferred illness. It required less adjustment. Later, as she walked home, Miss Marple took the longer route, passing the green and the row of shops. At the butcher's, a remark floated out between 2 customers about how money troubles aged a man terribly. At the post office, someone wondered aloud whether Mr. Hale's distant cousin might now be obliged to visit more often. No one explained why. No one needed to. The village understood itself very well. In the afternoon, Miss Marple called upon Mrs. Carter, who was polishing the already polished sideboard with determined enthusiasm. She spoke of entirely ordinary things until, quite naturally, she mentioned that it was a pity Mr. Hale had not seemed himself at dinner. He was distracted, Mrs. Carter agreed quickly, kept glancing toward the study. I noticed it at once. Miss Marple said she had noticed it too. Mrs. Carter looked pleased, then leaned closer and added that she had once seen him come out of that study looking quite unlike himself. Pale. Shaken. She laughed softly afterward, as though embarrassed by the suggestion. Still, she said, one never knows what worries people carry behind closed doors. Miss Marple thought of the closed study door, newly shut that morning, and nodded. As she left, a final remark followed her to the gate. Mrs. Carter mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that Mr. Hale had recently asked about the location of old family papers. Deeds, letters. She had thought nothing of it at the time. People often thought nothing of such things until they were required to think very hard indeed. That evening, Miss Marple attended the church committee meeting, where the business of hymn numbers and roof repairs proceeded with admirable seriousness. Yet beneath the respectable surface, conversation twitched and shifted, seeking openings. During a pause, Mrs. Halbrook remarked how fortunate it was that everyone had been together recently. So much easier, she said, smiling tightly, when people can speak openly. Miss Marple noticed how her fingers pressed into her handbag as she spoke, leaving faint creases in the leather. Open conversation was rarely comfortable. After the meeting, as coats were retrieved and goodnights exchanged, Miss Marple found herself walking beside Mrs. Halbrook. She commented gently on the dinner, thanking her again for the pleasant company. Mrs. Halbrook replied too quickly, assuring her that everything had gone exactly as intended. Exactly, Miss Marple thought, was a dangerous word. They parted at the corner, but not before Mrs. Halbrook added, in a tone meant to sound light, that she hoped no one would start imagining difficulties where none existed. The sentence ended with a laugh that fell rather flat against the cool evening air. On her way home, Miss Marple paused briefly by the Hale house. Lights burned downstairs, but upstairs only one window glowed faintly. The study remained dark. She recalled the serving dish changed during dessert, the maid's glance toward that very door, and the coat left draped where it did not belong. At home, she sat with her notebook, not writing, merely thinking. She considered how gossip functioned in villages, not as invention, but as collection. Each person added a fragment. Few checked whether the pieces fit. And then there was the cousin. Miss Marple had heard the name twice that day, spoken vaguely, never directly. A cousin who might visit. A cousin who might have an interest. She made a mental note to ask, casually, about family connections. Casual questions were often the most revealing. As she prepared for bed, another detail returned to her with quiet insistence. At Mrs. Linton's, someone had mentioned the raised voice weeks earlier. Not anger, exactly. Urgency. That distinction mattered. Urgency suggested a deadline. Miss Marple turned down the lamp and lay listening to the house settle around her. The village had already decided that the matter was one of health, of strain, of unfortunate timing. Yet the small domestic details told a different story, one of preparation, concealment, and conversations meant to remain unheard. And Miss Marple, closing her eyes at last, felt the certainty grow that beneath the polite sympathy and careful gossip, the village had brushed past the edge of something far darker, and had not yet realized how close it had come. Chapter 4. The letter appeared when no one was watching, which was precisely how such things preferred to arrive. Miss Marple became aware of it during a quiet afternoon visit that had been intended to be entirely unremarkable. Mrs. Halbrook had invited her for tea, the sort of invitation extended out of habit rather than enthusiasm, and Miss Marple accepted with equal politeness. The sitting room smelled faintly of lavender polish and overbrewed tea, the windows closed despite the mildness of the day. Everything suggested an effort to keep the world at a careful distance. Conversation began harmlessly enough. Mrs. Halbrook spoke of the church flowers, of how difficult it was to decide on arrangements when tastes differed. Miss Marple agreed sympathetically, remarking how disagreements were often disguised as preferences. Mrs. Halbrook laughed at that, a short, quick sound, then reached for a book from the side table to show Miss Marple a pressed flower she claimed to have forgotten inside it years ago. It was then that the letter slipped free. It fell lightly, landing face down on the rug, as though hoping not to be noticed. Mrs. Halbrook froze. Only for a moment, but Miss Marple saw it. She always saw such moments. The pause came too early to be accidental and ended too late to be natural. "Oh dear," Mrs. Halbrook said at last, bending to retrieve it. Miss Marple moved more quickly, her movement gentle, but decisive. "Let me," she said kindly, already picking it up. The paper was heavier than expected, folded once with careful precision. There was no address on the visible side, only a faint crease, worn thin by repeated handling. Mrs. Halbrook's fingers brushed Miss Marple's hand, then withdrew at once. "It's nothing," she said too quickly. "Just some business matter." Miss Marple smiled and returned the letter without comment, though she had already noticed the date in the corner. It was recent. Very recent. She remarked lightly that people were always surprised by how many matters could be called business. Mrs. Halbrook agreed, though her eyes had drifted away, fixed on the mantelpiece as though measuring distance. Tea was poured, cups filled. Mrs. Halbrook's hand shook slightly as she lifted the pot, enough for Miss Marple to notice, not enough for the spill to betray it. When Miss Marple commented on the warmth of the room, Mrs. Halbrook crossed to the window and opened it at once, as though grateful for an excuse to move. They spoke then of the dinner. Mrs. Halbrook insisted it had been a success, though her voice carried an edge of defensiveness. Miss Marple mentioned, in passing, how attentive Mr. Hale had been until his sudden departure. The name landed heavily between them. "He does try so hard," Mrs. Halbrook said. "Too hard. Sometimes." Miss Marple agreed. "Effort," she said, "could be exhausting when one felt pressed for time." Mrs. Halbrook turned from the window sharply. "Pressed?" she repeated. "I wouldn't say that." Miss Marple apologized gently, remarking that it was only a figure of speech. Mrs. Halbrook nodded, but she did not return to her seat immediately. Instead, she lingered by the window, staring out at the hedge as though it might answer her thoughts. The conversation drifted again, but it did not recover its earlier ease. Miss Marple noticed how often Mrs. Halbrook's gaze flicked toward the book from which the letter had fallen. When Miss Marple rose to leave, Mrs. Halbrook accompanied her to the door with marked relief. Outside, Miss Marple paused, adjusting her gloves. "I hope," she said mildly, "that Mr. Hale is improving." Mrs. Halbrook hesitated. "He's resting," she said, choosing the word with care. "There's been quite enough fuss." Miss Marple agreed wholeheartedly. Fuss, she observed, often complicated matters unnecessarily. As she walked away, she felt certain that the letter had complicated matters already. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple encountered the maid from the Hale house in the lane. The girl was carrying a small bundle of papers tied with string. She greeted Miss Marple politely, then added, as though thinking aloud, that it was curious how many old letters people kept, even when they no longer wished to read them. Miss Marple remarked that letters had a way of remembering things on one's behalf. The maid flushed slightly, and said she supposed that was true. At home, Miss Marple sat by her window, reviewing the day. The letter. The date. The insistence that it was business. She recalled Mrs. Hale's earlier discomfort, when wills had been mentioned at dinner, and the cousins spoken of so vaguely by others. Letters, she reflected, were rarely threatening in words alone. It was their timing that mattered. That evening, she was visited by Mrs. Linton, who arrived with the excuse of returning a dish, but stayed to talk far longer than necessary. She mentioned, in a tone of mild surprise, that she had once seen Mr. Hale receive a letter that upset him greatly. He tried to laugh it off, Mrs. Linton said, stirring her tea, but his hands were shaking. "I remember thinking it must be very important correspondence indeed." Miss Marple asked when this had been. Mrs. Linton thought for a moment. "Not long ago, just before he announced the dinner. That settled it." As Mrs. Linton left, she added one more detail, offered hesitantly. "Mr. Hale," she said, had asked whether letters could ever be used as evidence of intention. At the time, she had thought it an odd question. Now, she wondered. Miss Marple wondered, too. Night fell early, the sky heavy with cloud. Miss Marple prepared her supper and ate thoughtfully, her mind turning over small impressions, aligning them gently until they formed a clearer shape. Someone had written a letter. Someone had wanted it read. or feared it would be. Someone had chosen the dinner as a moment of gathering, of containment. The study door, she recalled, had been closed the morning after. Rooms were closed when people wished to hide what had occurred inside them. Before bed, Miss Marple took out her notebook at last. She did not write names, only observations. A letter, carefully folded. A date too close for comfort, hands that trembled, voices that shifted. When she extinguished the lamp, one thought remained with her. Persistent and unwelcome. Letters did not kill. People did. But letters could push people to decisions they believed unavoidable. And Miss Marple, lying awake in the dark, felt certain that the letter she had glimpsed, so briefly, so tellingly, had not merely carried words, but had drawn the first unmistakable line between intention and action. Chapter 5. Money had a way of changing its manners when discussed in polite company. Miss Marple noticed this almost at once when she accepted Mrs. Hale's invitation for a quiet afternoon visit. An invitation framed as concern, but delivered with the faint stiffness of obligation. The sitting room was neat, carefully arranged, yet something about it felt unsettled, as though objects had been moved and returned too often in recent days. The fire was lit despite the mild weather, its warmth pressing insistently against the room, and the curtains were drawn just enough to dim the light. They spoke first of ordinary things, of how exhausting the week had been, of how the village meant well but talked too much. Miss Marple agreed sympathetically, remarking that concern was often indistinguishable from curiosity. Mrs. Hale smiled at that, though the smile did not last. It was Mrs. Hale who introduced the subject, though she did so obliquely, as though hoping it might pass unnoticed. She mentioned, quite casually, that dealing with accounts had become tiresome lately, that paperwork accumulated when one least expected it. Miss Marple nodded and replied that papers had a habit of appearing when matters were unsettled. Mrs. Hale's hand paused on her teacup. "Oh, nothing is unsettled," she said quickly. "Merely routine adjustments. The word hovered between them, familiar now. Miss Marple thought of the dinner table remark about altered wills, laughed away too easily. She said nothing, allowing silence to do its quiet work. Mrs. Hale filled it at once. "My husband was always very particular about such things," she continued. "He believed in fairness, in keeping everything balanced." Balanced was another word people reached for when balance had already been lost. As they spoke, Miss Marple's attention drifted gently around the room. A ledger lay half hidden beneath a stack of magazines, its corner peeking out at an odd angle. It had not been there on her previous visit. Ledgers were rarely consulted casually, and never left within reach unless they were troubling someone. Miss Marple commented on the fire, asking whether it was truly necessary. Mrs. Hale replied that the house felt cold lately. Miss Marple observed that houses often felt colder when there were worries beneath the surface. Mrs. Hale laughed softly, though she did not disagree. Later, as Miss Marple took her leave, she encountered the housemaid in the corridor. The girl hesitated, then said, in a low voice, that it must be difficult to keep track of everything when there were so many papers involved. Miss Marple replied gently that organization depended greatly on timing. The girl nodded, relief flickering briefly across her face, as though someone had understood something she dared not explain. Outside, Miss Marple walked slowly, turning the visit over in her mind. Accounts. Adjustments. Ledgers left carelessly visible. All pointed toward strain, and strain, she had long known, bred resentment. That evening, she attended a small gathering at Mrs. Carter's, one of those informal affairs that pretended to be social while serving far more practical purposes. Conversation drifted easily from one subject to another, until Mr. Fenwick remarked that it was fortunate some people had independent means, as money complicated friendships terribly. Mrs. Carter agreed, adding that debts had a way of resurfacing at the most inconvenient times. Miss Marple listened. Mr. Fenwick spoke then, almost reluctantly, saying that Mr. Hale had once mentioned being disappointed in someone who had misunderstood generosity for weakness. He stopped abruptly, clearing his throat, and said no more. Miss Marple asked with apparent innocence whether such misunderstandings were common. Mr. Fenwick replied that they were, especially when expectations had been allowed to grow unchecked. As the evening progressed, a domestic detail emerged that Miss Marple filed away at once. Mrs. Carter mentioned that during the dinner, she had gone briefly into the hall and seen a servant emerge from the study looking flustered, clutching a set of keys. At the time, she had thought little of it. Keys, Miss Marple reflected, were seldom handled without purpose. The next morning, Miss Marple encountered Mrs. Linton at the post office. Mrs. Linton, after some hesitation, confided that she had heard raised voices from the Hale house late one evening, not long before the dinner. Not angry voices, she clarified. Controlled ones. Voices that spoke carefully, each word chosen as though it mattered greatly. Miss Marple asked who had been present. Mrs. Linton said she was not sure, but she believed Mr. Hale had been speaking to someone he trusted, or once trusted. The distinction mattered. Later still, Miss Marple called briefly at the Hale house, under the pretense of returning a dish. The atmosphere had shifted again. There was a strained politeness in every exchange, an eagerness to appear settled. She noticed that the study door was now locked, not merely closed, but locked. The keyhole gleamed faintly, freshly polished. She remarked on it casually, suggesting that it was sensible to keep papers secure. Mrs. Hale agreed too quickly, adding that it was best not to have things misplaced. Her hand hovered near her pocket as she spoke, then withdrew, empty. Miss Marple did not ask where the key was kept. Before leaving, she noticed something else. On the sideboard lay a stack of correspondence, neatly tied, all of similar size and paper. One envelope bore a faint impression where a seal had once been broken and resealed. Miss Marple commented lightly on how satisfying it was to bring order to old letters. Mrs. Hale replied that it was necessary, sometimes, to decide what to keep and what to discard. Decisions again. That afternoon, Miss Marple sat in her own sitting room, reflecting. Money. Letters. Locked doors. Raised voices. None of it was dramatic. None of it would attract attention beyond the village. Yet together, they suggested motive as clearly as any confession. Someone had expected something. Someone else had refused. Accounts had been adjusted. Generosity redefined. And somewhere between expectation and refusal, resentment had hardened. As evening approached, Miss Marple received one more piece of information, delivered with the careful hesitancy of someone unsure whether it ought to be shared at all. The vicar mentioned, quite casually, that Mr. Hale had recently asked about changing beneficiaries for a small charitable donation. Not large, merely symbolic, but the question had been asked with unusual urgency. Urgency again. Miss Marple thanked him and returned home, her mind moving steadily now. She thought of the dinner invitation, so carefully worded, of the gathering of all concerned in one place, of the study, closed and locked, of letters tied and retied. Money did not kill, any more than letters did. But disappointment over money, Miss Marple had learned, could drive people to extraordinary measures, especially when pride was involved. As night settled over the village, Miss Marple prepared for bed, feeling the familiar quiet certainty that comes when a pattern begins to show itself. The matter was no longer vague. It was no longer merely odd. It was shaping itself into something deliberate, and Miss Marple, turning out the light, felt sure of one thing. Whoever had acted had done so believing they were owed something, and that belief, far more than money itself, had set the entire chain of events in motion. Chapter 6. The smile arrived just a little too late. Miss Marple noticed it at once, though no one else appeared to. It was Sunday morning, and the village had gathered as it always did. Coats brushed, shoes polished, voices softened into suitable tones. The bells had finished their gentle calling, and people were settling into familiar places when Mrs. Halbrook entered, paused, and smiled, only after realizing she was being watched. The delay was brief, almost imperceptible. But to Miss Marple, It rang louder than the bells themselves. She observed the rest of the congregation quietly. Mr. Fenwick sat stiffly, his hands folded too precisely in his lap. Mrs. Hale arrived last, her expression composed, though she chose a seat nearer the aisle than usual, as if ready to leave at a moment's notice. The service began, words spoken about patience, understanding, and forgiveness. Miss Marple listened, but she listened more closely to the silences between people than to the sermon itself. During the hymns, she noticed how Mrs. Halbrook did not sing at all. Her lips moved, but no sound followed. When the final note faded, she let out a breath that seemed held for far too long. After the service, the congregation spilled out into the bright morning, forming small knots of conversation. Miss Marple lingered near the edge, greeting acquaintances, accepting remarks about the weather and the comfort of routine. It was there, amid the casual chatter, that a careless remark slipped free. Mrs. Price said, quite lightly, that it was fortunate the study door had been locked when it was. Miss Marple turned to her with polite interest. Locked? She repeated gently, I hadn't realized it had been. Mrs. Price flushed at once. Oh, well, I only assumed, she said quickly. One hears things. People talk. Miss Marple agreed that people always did. What interested her was not the assumption, but the certainty with which it had been spoken. Mrs. Price excused herself shortly thereafter, her conversation abandoned as though it had grown suddenly dangerous. Miss Marple moved on, eventually finding herself beside Mr. Fenwick near the lich gate. He commented on the service, remarking that it was comforting to hear familiar words at a time like this. Miss Marple replied that familiarity was often what people clung to when they feared change. He glanced at her sharply, then away again. There's been enough change already, he said, more firmly than necessary. Miss Marple agreed, adding that sudden change sometimes forced people to reveal more than they intended. Mr. Fenwick shifted his weight, then said too casually that it was odd how certain people knew details before they were spoken aloud. Details? Miss Marple prompted mildly. He hesitated. Small things about that night. Who went where? When? Miss Marple remarked that memory could be unreliable, especially when shaped by conversation. Mr. Fenwick nodded, but his eyes remained troubled. He added, after a pause, that he had seen Mrs. Halbrook near the study corridor later than most that evening. At the time, he had thought nothing of it. Miss Marple thought of it now. That afternoon, she called upon Mrs. Linton, who was sorting linens with more vigor than necessary. She spoke warmly of the service, of how reassuring it was to see everyone together. Mrs. Linton agreed, then added that togetherness had been precisely what Mr. Hale had wanted. He said it was important, she said, that everyone hear the same things. Miss Marple asked what things those might have been. Mrs. Linton frowned, then laughed softly, saying she could not recall exactly. Only that it had sounded serious at the time. As they spoke, Miss Marple noticed a small detail on the side table, a folded program from the service, marked faintly with pencil. A time noted, a name underlined. Mrs. Linton followed her gaze and moved the paper at once. Oh, I make notes sometimes, she said lightly. Helps me remember. Miss Marple remarked that memory often needed assistance when events became complicated. Mrs. Linton did not respond at once. Later, Miss Marple took a walk, passing the Hale house as she had done many times before. The study window remained dark, though it was mid-afternoon. The rest of the house showed signs of life. Curtains drawn back. A window opened to air the rooms. The study alone remained sealed, as though time had stopped there. She paused at the gate, just long enough to notice Mrs. Hale inside, standing in the hall, speaking quietly to someone Miss Marple could not see. The conversation ended abruptly. Mrs. Hale turned and saw Miss Marple. her expression shifting into polite warmth that again arrived a moment too late. They exchanged greetings. Miss Marple commented on the fine day. Mrs. Hale agreed, then added, quite unnecessarily, that it was good to have matters settling at last. Settling? Miss Marple echoed gently. Mrs. Hale smiled. Well, becoming clearer. Miss Marple said she was glad to hear it. Clarity, she observed, often arrived after difficult decisions had been made. Mrs. Hale's smile faltered. Just slightly. That evening, Miss Marple received a visit from the vicar, who stopped by with the excuse of returning a book. He mentioned with some hesitation that he had been asked an odd question earlier in the week. About forgiveness, he said. Whether it could be sufficient. Miss Marple asked sufficient for what? The vicar shook his head. He had not been told. Only that the question had been asked with great seriousness. Miss Marple thanked him and saw him out, her thoughts already aligning themselves with growing clarity. Late smiles. Early knowledge. Locked doors discussed too freely. Words chosen with care. Someone knew more than they should. Someone had been present where they claimed not to be. As night fell, Miss Marple sat quietly, reviewing faces rather than facts. Faces rarely lied well. She thought again of Mrs. Halbrook's delayed smile, of Mr. Fenwick's uneasy certainty, of Mrs. Hale's careful phrasing. One of them had been close to the truth long before it was spoken aloud. Close enough to shape events, close enough to act, and Miss Marple, preparing for bed, felt the calm certainty deepen that the smallest slip, a smile delayed, a word misplaced, had revealed far more than any confession ever could. Chapter 7. The invitation was modest, almost apologetic, which was precisely why everyone accepted it. Miss Marple phrased it as a simple afternoon gathering, tea, a few chairs drawn close, nothing more than a chance to sit together and be reassured by familiar company. There was no sense of occasion attached to it, no hint of purpose. And yet, by the time the clock struck 4, every chair in her sitting room was occupied, coats folded neatly over arms, cups held a little too carefully. Miss Marple noticed where everyone chose to sit. Mrs. Hale positioned herself closest to the door. Mr. Fenwick selected a chair slightly apart from the others, angled just enough to observe without appearing to do so. Mrs. Halbrook sat opposite Miss Marple, her back straight, hands folded, expression attentive. No one spoke at first. The kettle's soft murmur filled the silence until Miss Marple poured the tea and the room exhaled as one. She began with harmless recollections. How pleasant the dinner had been. How kind Mr. Hale had always been to the village. Heads nodded. Murmurs of agreement followed. Miss Marple allowed the warmth to settle before gently revisiting a small detail. It was thoughtful of him, she said mildly, to gather everyone together at once. Mrs. Linton agreed quickly, adding that it saved repetition. Mrs. Halbrook smiled and said it was efficient. Miss Marple nodded, then remarked that efficiency was often valuable when time felt uncertain. The room shifted. Just slightly. She spoke next of letters, of how surprising it was how many old correspondences resurfaced during times of change. She said it lightly, stirring her tea as though the thought had occurred to her only then. Mrs. Hale's cup paused midway to her lips. Mr. Fenwick looked down at his saucer. Miss Marple continued, unhurried. She mentioned the study, how useful it must have been for sorting papers, for privacy. Mrs. Halbrook responded that privacy was sometimes necessary. Miss Marple agreed, adding that locked doors, however, had a way of attracting attention. No one likes to feel excluded, she said pleasantly. Mrs. Halbrook's fingers tightened against her handbag. Miss Marple turned then to the matter of the night itself. She spoke not of events, but of impressions, of how quiet the house had been after the dinner, of how some people had slept poorly, disturbed by movement. She did not accuse. She merely observed. Mr. Fenwick cleared his throat. There were footsteps, he said. I'm certain of it. Miss Marple thanked him for confirming what others had hinted at. She remarked that purposeful footsteps suggested intention. Mrs. Hale protested gently that houses made noises at night. Miss Marple agreed wholeheartedly and added that houses rarely locked their own doors. Silence followed, the kind that pressed rather than settled. Miss Marple allowed it to stretch before speaking again. She recalled, quite calmly, the remark made at dinner about altered wills. She said she had thought nothing of it at the time, yet in hindsight found it rather telling. People joke about what troubles them most, she said kindly. Mrs. Halbrook laughed, though the sound was thin. Surely you don't mean. Miss Marple raised a hand gently. I mean nothing at all, she said, only that certain remarks arrive precisely when they are meant to. She turned then, very deliberately, to Mrs. Halbrook. It must have been difficult, she said softly, to realize that generosity would not be rewarded as expected. The words landed with care, but they landed true. Mrs. Halbrook's color drained almost imperceptibly. She protested that she had never expected reward. Miss Marple agreed, saying that expectations were rarely spoken aloud, especially when pride was involved. She spoke then of the letter, not its contents, but its presence, its timing. How letters written under pressure often sounded calm, while carrying great urgency beneath them. Mrs. Halbrook opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again. Miss Marple continued, still gentle. She explained how the dinner had served a purpose beyond hospitality. It gathered witnesses. It created routine. It established normality before something irrevocable occurred. Mrs. Hale stood abruptly. This is quite enough, she said. Miss Marple looked at her with genuine sympathy. Yes, she said quietly. It is. She turned back to Mrs. Halbrook. You were seen near the study corridor late that night, she said. You spoke of matters being settled before they were. You knew the door was locked, because you had locked it. Mrs. Halbrook's composure cracked, just slightly. I only wanted what was fair, she said. After all I had done. Miss Marple nodded. So you believed. And when fairness did not arrive, you chose certainty instead. The room felt very still. Miss Marple concluded gently, explaining how a small, deliberate act, planned, disguised as care, had ensured no interruption. How illness had been expected, not questioned. How intention had hidden itself behind manners. No one spoke for a long moment. At last, Mrs. Halbrook lowered her head. I never meant it to go so far, she said. Miss Marple rose, her voice warm but unyielding. It always does, she said softly, when people decide outcomes for others. As the afternoon light faded, Miss Marple looked around the room, meeting each gaze in turn. The truth had arrived not with drama, but with quiet inevitability. And Miss Marple, standing amid the shattered calm of polite society, knew that the matter was finished, though its consequences were only just beginning to be felt. Chapter 8. The village learned the truth quietly, which was the only way it ever could have learned it at all. Miss Marple was already awake when the knock came, soft but deliberate, as though the hand that struck the door wished to be polite even now. She rose at once, her mind calm, her thoughts neatly arranged, for there was no surprise left in her. Surprise belonged to those who had not been paying attention. Mrs. Halbrook stood on the step, her coat buttoned incorrectly, her hair pinned with unusual haste. The morning air carried the scent of damp earth and something sharper beneath it. Fear, Miss Marple thought, had a smell of its own. Mrs. Halbrook did not ask to come in. She simply looked at Miss Marple and said, in a voice stripped of all decoration, that she could not bear the waiting any longer. Miss Marple stepped aside and ushered her in. They sat opposite one another, the space between them neat and orderly, like the space at a table where decisions were made. Mrs. Halbrook clasped her hands together, then released them, then clasped them again. She spoke at last, not in confession but in explanation, which was far more telling. She spoke of years of quiet sacrifice, of money lent and favors granted with the unspoken understanding that gratitude would one day take tangible form. She spoke of promises never made aloud but strongly implied, of assurances given in tone and gesture rather than words. Mr. Hale, she said, had always known what she expected. He had simply chosen not to deliver it. Miss Marple listened without interruption. Mrs. Halbrook described the letter then, how it had been written carefully, calmly, outlining what she believed to be owed. She admitted that the reply had not been what she expected. It had been polite, firm, final. Mr. Hale had intended to change arrangements, to ensure independence rather than obligation. He had believed he was being fair. And I couldn't allow that, Mrs. Halbrook said quietly. Not after everything. Miss Marple nodded. So you planned, she said gently. Yes, Mrs. Halbrook replied, the word falling like a stone dropped into still water. I planned. She spoke of the dinner, of how it had been meant to establish normality, of how illness, once suggested, was easily accepted. People preferred explanations that allowed them to remain comfortable. She described the study, the locked door, the careful timing. She did not dramatize it. She did not need to. The quiet precision of her words did that work for her. Miss Marple said nothing until Mrs. Halbrook finished. Then she spoke, her voice calm, almost kind. She pointed out the small things that had undone the plan, the replaced dish, the lingering scent that did not belong, the misplaced certainty of those who knew too much too soon. She explained how the delayed smile, the early assumptions, the locked door spoken of too freely had drawn attention where none was meant to exist. You were very nearly successful, Miss Marple said. But you underestimated the village. Mrs. Halbrook looked up sharply. Not its cleverness, Miss Marple continued, but its memory. Villages remember tone, timing, the way people speak when they believe no one is listening. Mrs. Halbrook's shoulders sagged then, the last of her composure slipping away. She did not weep. She merely looked tired. Later that morning, Miss Marple accompanied her quietly down the lane, where the constable waited with respectful seriousness. There were no raised voices, no spectacle, only the gentle closing of a chapter the village had sensed long before it understood. By afternoon, the village resumed its routines with admirable determination. Curtains were opened. Shops conducted business. Tea was poured. People spoke in lowered voices, careful not to say too much. Yet beneath the surface, understanding spread, not dramatically, but thoroughly. Miss Marple received visitors throughout the day, each arriving under some practical excuse. They asked no direct questions. They did not need answers. They needed reassurance that the order they relied upon had not been an illusion. She gave it to them, gently. That evening, she took a walk past the Hale house. The windows were dark now, the silence settled, and final. The study door would be opened soon. Papers examined, decisions catalogued and filed away. Order would return, though it would not resemble the order that had existed before. As she turned back toward home, she reflected, not for the first time, that danger rarely announced itself with noise or chaos. It arrived quietly, dressed in politeness, carrying grievances nurtured over years. At home, Miss Marple sat by her window as twilight softened the village edges. She thought of Mr. Hale, of his belief that clarity could be achieved without consequence. She thought of Mrs. Halbrook, who had mistaken entitlement for justice. And she thought of how easily ordinary lives brushed against irrevocable acts. The village would speak of this for years, she knew, but never quite accurately. Details would blur, motives would simplify. The truth would become something more comfortable. That, too, was human nature. Miss Marple rose at last, turning down the lamp. The matter was finished. The village would sleep again, believing itself safe. And perhaps it was, for now. And Miss Marple, pausing at the threshold of her room, allowed herself a small, thoughtful smile. Knowing that while secrets always found ways to surface, It was often the quietest minds that heard them first and understood them best.